histories, and I've been playing these suites for about 60 years now, and I keep finding more and more surprises and things that I didn't know were there. And I'm sure if I had another 60 years that I could play the suite, I would keep finding more and more wonders in there because they're just so rich. So I'm going to go through the whole first suite tonight, and I'll show you just a couple things in the Allemande before I play it. One thing is it's got a very square rhythm, but if we play it square and accent the beats, then it just kind of sits there and doesn't work too well. I'll play it square for a second. To do that, actually. I'm going to play a different way now, trying to indicate the voice leading in this piece, which is not accenting the beat. Maybe you'll hear a difference. It's different. So actually it swings, even though it's in a very kind of square rhythm. Not only does it swing, but then you start to hear the marvels of these voices that are leading one note to the other, and then there's a response, and then so it's kind of like you're having a wonderful conversation with yourself as you play the piece. Often there's a bass line that's kind of hidden because there's only one note of the bass line and then there's a bunch of other notes. Then there's another note of the bass line and there's a bunch of other notes. So the bass line can't continue the way it can with a keyboard piece because you're only playing one note at a time. Actually, the passage that I just played is a good example. I'm going to show you the bass a little more. It's amazing. So now I'll play the Allemande for you. One of the charming features of an Allemande is that it ends twice. The first half comes to a cadence, and it would have been fine to stop there, but then he kind of repeats the cadence. That's the style of the Allemande. And then at the very end of the movement, he does the same thing. He makes a wonderful cadence in C major, and then adds one more bar like, yes, I really meant it, we're back in C major. So you're not hearing any weird sound from the microphone if I just leave it on, right? It's okay? Okay. always a courante in all of these pieces and all of these suites. And the courante opens with a repeated C and then a descending C major chord. And I'll play, again, just the notes. I'll play the notes, and then we'll talk about it. Casals said, this is the melody. So those notes aren't sustained, but Casals played the first notes very strong, and then the descending notes he played much lighter, so that you actually hear in relief the melody. Of course, Casals was attacked by the purists for taking liberties with this music, for playing with the bow off the string. There are wonderful master classes that were shot in Berkeley in the early 60s. My dear friend Janet Guggenheim, who plays in the Florestan Trio with me, actually played for a lot of the cellists in those classes and ended up playing with Casals in some of those classes. And she was in school then, and she'll never forget any of those sessions. In one of those classes, he says, the purists are scandalized by the way I play Bach. And then he would smile, because that's what they're there for. That's what the purists are there for, to criticize, and it doesn't affect the thing itself. I mean, I always tell my students that one thing you can always depend on, if you play Bach, somebody's going to criticize you for either being too free or not free enough, or using too much vibrato or not enough vibrato, and why are you using steel strings and not using gut strings? And so I always advise people to find a way of playing the pieces that make sense to you, that you really like. And then some people will like it, and some people won't, especially if there are cellists in the audience, they won't like it. But you can't try to please everyone. First, you have to be convinced by what you're doing, and the way I play these pieces has changed and evolved over the years, so what I used to like, I don't like it anymore. So at least I'm kind of re-examining things. The Courante is full of these wonderful implicit voices. I'll play you a passage toward the end of the second half, which is probably my favorite passage in the whole movement, that just has this astounding bass line. I'll play first the notes, then I'll emphasize a little the bass line. Again, I'm in awe of what he was able to do to make the piece continue and make it sound like that's the tune, and yet there's all this sort of hidden under the surface and treasures to be discovered once you look at it very closely and live with it for a while. And then also if you have inspiring role models or mentors. I mean, I grew up listening to the recordings of Casals, and then Pierre Fournier, and then Janos Starker. Those were probably my three favorite cellists, and they all play so different than one another. there's almost no similarity. It was a completely different style. And so then what do? Then you have to find your own way. So you can still honor the legacy and acknowledge the debt to these great artists that helped us find our way. Starker used to say, how do we find our way through this maze? When you look at the page, there's 2 pages of 16th notes. That's all there is there. It's like you could get lost in there, and you have to have sort of a plan. You have to have some route, some escape route, and an entry point. So the fact that he acknowledged that was helpful for those of us who were beginning the process. Sets the key that all the movements of the suite are in, except for one, the second minuet or the second bourrée or the second gavotte. That's the only one that's not in the key of the prelude. And the prelude is not a dance movement, it's more like an improvisation to establish the character of the suite. Well, the prelude of this suite is in my feeling, an incredible affirmation and a strong positive statement, and also a practical key for the cello, because the lowest note on the cello is a low C. So Bach was no fool, and he wrote suites that were in C major, C minor, D major, D minor, and G major, and then there's one that's in E flat major, which is much less natural to play. And I think it actually is performed least often of all the suites, partly because the key is so difficult, but it's just as beautiful as any of the other suites. So all the movements are in the same key. So if you play a whole suite, it could be kind of monotonous to play for 15 or 20 minutes, basically in C major. One of the things Casals used to say was, the worst enemy of music is monotony. And you can say what you want about Pablo Casals, and everybody always did and still does, but his playing was never monotonous. It was never uninteresting, without understanding and shape. And you may disagree maybe with some things about what he did, but he brought the music to life. And I think I've often told this story that Casals worked on these suites for 12 years after he discovered them as a young man by accident in a store. No one had told him about these suites, and he found the music, and he took it home and couldn't believe it and started studying them. 12 years later, he started performing these suites in public, and he was the first cellist to ever play a whole suite in public. So now, of course, everyone's doing that, and Yo-Yo Ma has done a lot to kind of make the suites more known. But if not for Casals, none of this would have happened. So when I have a student who comes in after 2 weeks and says, well, I think I've kind of learned that Allemande, I say, well, let me tell you a story. And their eyes get wide, and I say, I'm not saying you should work on this suite for 12 years, but maybe give it another couple of weeks to see if you can take it a little bit higher or a little farther. And the story is supposed to be an inspiration about how much he cared about these pieces and how hard he worked. Casals is also my hero because he freely and happily and openly acknowledged how hard he worked. There are those famous musicians who brag about how little they work because that's the only way that they can feel superior to someone else who's also lying, who talks about how little they worked. Because anybody who ever says that is lying. It's just absolutely lying. Somebody says, oh, I only practice an hour and a half a day, that's all I need. And they say, oh, that much, huh? I only practice an hour a day. And then it's just absurd, it's ridiculous. Casals said, I've been told that I play the cello with the ease of a bird in flight. Well, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of hours went into a bird learning to fly, but I can tell you that the impression of ease only comes after the greatest effort. That's one of my favorite sayings from Casals. The other one, of course, is when he was 93 years old, he was practicing. And he was practicing quite a while, and somebody knocked on the door and said, Maestro, you've been the most famous cellist in the world for over 70 years, and you're sitting here practicing 2 hours. What's up? And he looked at the person and said, I'm beginning to notice some progress. So it's like Pablo, you know, that's I think that's a very healthy example for us. And the other is unhealthy, the lying about how little you work. Well, after the Courante, there's always a sarabande,